Hi, my name is Stas Naiman. I'm a director of product marketing at Akamai, and today I'm talking to Patrick Sullivan at RSA 2026. Patrick is a field CTO focusing on security strategy, and he's been with Akamai for over 20 years. Patrick, welcome.
Thank you. Another RSA. Very exciting.
Yeah, Patrick, over your tenure at Akamai, you've seen all sorts of trends and eras come and go, but I think AI is one of the biggest ones. So what do you see, how do you see application security changing in the era of AI?
Absolutely. I think AI is changing every facet of application security, maybe starting with adversarial use of AI. Really there, what that's representing is more attacker coverage, right? If there was maybe a vulnerability on a secondary part of your application, maybe you had a little bit of a luxury of time before an adversary would get to that. I think what we're seeing now are AI tools dominate pen testing. The window of exposure is, before you get owned, is certainly compressed. So that's sort of on the adversarial side. I think if we think about the nature of applications, people are building AI first-party applications, which has a unique attack surface, comprising the sum of our classic OWASP risk, our OWASP API risk, and then now sort of the OWASP LLM risk. The unique attack surface of the LLM itself. But perhaps the biggest change out of all of these are sort of the changes to the SDLC, right? We have classical developers availing themselves of LLMs and copilots to develop code more rapidly, for sure. And then we also have the democratization of code. So people in other functions, somebody in finance, somebody in marketing, somebody in sales, they can if they can communicate in English or Spanish or some of their language, they're a coder and they can develop applications. So all of those, I think, are changing. And so is the attack surface. I think if you follow the news, we're all here as a security community at RSA, but the security supply chain is sort of on fire this week with a lot of the developer tools being exploited. And my thought there is that sort of developers are the new perimeter, right? They're being targeted as an entry point into the organization as well.
Yeah. So do you think that sort of traditional approaches are out of the window, no longer apply? We have to rethink the whole situation?
I think the bad news for security in general and AppSec in particular is we tend to stack risks, right? If you think about sort of your latest and greatest, the most innovative company that has a AI API that's exposed as a chatbot, we've seen them be compromised with 30-year-old web vulnerabilities for directory traversal, right? So that those techniques are still relevant. You still need to protect them from your classic DOS. DOS probably takes a new form of risk with AI in the form of a financial DOS, right? If somebody can exploit your application and make you burn a ton of tokens on the back end, that's sort of a greater risk now than it was. API risk is certainly at the forefront because all of these AI interfaces are communicating via APIs. And if you don't have that hygiene in place as well, that could be an exploitation path. Plus, you get the new risks associated with the LLM and its ability to communicate in native language in and of itself, the prompt injection and other risks.
What I'm hearing, though, is those are different aspects or different tools. So what I'm hearing is actually almost like a tool sprawl. You're getting, individual tools and silos that are trying to address these vulnerabilities or these vectors of attack. But I feel like actually having a platforms where everything communicates, you kind of have context across APIs and applications and bots and AI, of course, makes more sense in this era.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned 20 years. I think that's a lesson we've learned over and over again, right? I think back to DOS, and in the early days, people would sort of have one solution for layer 7 DOS. Maybe we were providing that as part of the WAF offering, and then they would do sort of BGP infrastructure protection over here on a different platform and DNS protection on yet another platform. So we found by combining those, we could follow an attacker across, right? Because attackers are using these techniques and you lose signal if you have different tooling across all of those. When you consolidate into a platform, you can follow that attacker. I think we saw the same innovation from Akamai to also pull bot detection into that approach, because there's a lot of signal you can gain from sort of disambiguating human versus bot as you're making a classic AppSec decision, right? So that was a benefit. And then we stacked API security into that same platform, because there's a lot of intelligence that can be derived from watching an adversary across the breadth of our platform at layer 7 and introducing that into kind of a newer protection with API security. So that the thought there throughout, the common theme is make life easier for AppSec. Nobody has enough folks on the AppSec team. I talked late into the night last night with people. Hey, do you have any API security experts you could refer? Do you have any AppSec experts? Anybody who's watching, if you know somebody, let us know. There's a lot of demand in the industry for those. But all of these, if you have to kind of piece together signal from all of these different tools, that's a big burden that's being placed on the AppSec team. Whereas on a platform, some of those things can seamlessly convey intelligence from one detection to another.
So it's almost like a platform becomes almost like the nervous system of the organization, or at least the security org, helping you feel and see everything that's going on in your limbs, in your legs, in your head, and just pulling it all together.
I think that's right? I think that's the way to think about it, because at the end of the day, we're all responding to attackers, right? And I always think about it, when I learned sort of pen testing, there's a series of techniques, but nobody gets up and says, I'm going to launch LLM top 10 attacks today, right? Or I'm going to launch SQL injection today, right? You go through your techniques, you bounce around, you do some recon at DNS, you do some footprinting on the web application itself via scanning, which is automation, and all the while that attacker is leaving, they're leaking intelligence that can be mined and exploited on the defensive side. But it has to be available at the right time, synchronously at that request.
Yeah.
So we think having that available immediately, turns the tables back on the attacker.
So actually, you pointed something interesting, that sort of intelligence, or I would like to call collective intelligence, the fact that we see sort of everything from most attacked organizations, right, and we try to protect them. So what does that actually mean, for Akamai and our customers? The fact that we do see things that maybe other organizations can't see across the entire app portfolio.
Yeah, absolutely. I think back to maybe that first point we made around the window to exploitation shrinking, right, or mass exploitation shrinking. So we're obviously, as we have been for 15, 20 years, we're monitoring all of these requests at layer 7 in a common security data lake. If we see anomalous requests, a lot of times that's our first indication that there's no valid reason why this request should occur. Let's go investigate that. And we've had humans doing that for a long time. And then more recently, we've had those humans training AI systems, labeling data as we see that, because that is a process that very much lends itself to AI, right? So I see something anomalous. Is that a novel attack that I see? Yes. Is there a detection that we can backtest against traffic to ensure that it's a safe mitigation? And then can we rapidly deploy that at scale? I think that's the only viable approach, right? And to your point, if one attacker has a novel attack, they're not going to use that in almost all cases just on one target. If they have success, they're going to go try to exploit that writ large.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that we can take that attack and then understand it, protect the customer, and deploy to all customers. It's free, right? So it's like protection by default of everything that we see, because we see a very large portion of the internet, and again, one of the most attacked, most complex environments in the world. So can you tell me, what do you think, where the vision, like where are we going with all this? It's 2026. Where do we see ourselves go?
Yeah, so I think it's all about speed, right? It's getting those detections to happen more quickly. Some of the attack surface that we're seeing is novel, right? I mean, I think we're all learning as we go of new attack techniques against AI applications. The flavor of the week seems to be the supply chain and going after developers, and even some of the developers' AST tools are being exploited as a way into the organization. So it comes down to speed. I think speed of detection, and for these novel attacks, we may be developing as an industry new techniques and catching up as we go. But the nice part about sort of an AI application is that it's sitting on top of API where there's signal that we can derive. That's sitting on top of sort of a classic web application and bot detection, which offers signal. So some of those really, really tricky AppSec corner cases you get into, maybe on prompt injection, there's a lot of intelligence that we can start out with, very much of a head start as we're trying to work through maybe those more novel attacks that we see.
So do you think that that is Akamai's sort of differentiation, the ability to see risk not in silos, but as it moves across the bots, the APIs, the application itself, the AI? Is there anything else?
Yeah, so I think all of those pieces, right? All of the techniques that an attacker would do, right? You start with DNS, you work your way through typically more your classic web app techniques to figure out what technologies, are on the back end to guide, future attacks. You used to do these things manually. Now, a lot of that is driven by automation. So we want to be there at every step of the way, deriving signal, right? And as these techniques and development patterns evolve, we want to keep up with that. Back to the changes to app dev, we do see sort of that code that is driven by a copilot or an AI driven tool. There tends to be more density. So if there is a PR, each request we're seeing have more change than what we typically would see from a human, right? So they're bulkier requests that go in. So that leads to speed of development, risk, and humans in that path certainly need automation to keep up.
Gotcha. So in a closing thought, if there's one thing that you would want security leaders to do something different, right, tomorrow, starting tomorrow, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's keeping the eye on supply chain, I think, is a big one, right? Just as we look at this week, right? If you think about this entire supply chain that you have, understanding how you're going to keep up with all of that risk at pace. A lot of that is going to be, responding to, you wake up in the morning and figure out where the fire is burning, right? So it's all about velocity of protection as we go.
Got it. Patrick, it's been really informative. Thank you so much. I'm excited for the rest of the 2026 RSA. If you'd like to find more information about our platform and application protection, please visit akamai.com. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.